In this video, I want to share some comments made by a recent expert in the teaching and thought and life of Ibn Taymiyya. I'm going to read a passage from this book, Ibn Taymiyya by John Hoover. He is a professor of Islamic studies at the University of Nottingham in England. And this is part of a series devoted to the great men and women throughout Islamic history who have made significant contributions to the Muslim world. A reviewer on the back says of this book, finally Ibn Taymiyya gets his first critical introduction in a Western language, and a really good one. That review is from Frank Griffel. He's professor of Islamic studies at the University of Yale in America. And in this video, I want to share Ibn Taymiyya's criticism of what he considers innovated Muslim festivals, such as the celebration of the Prophet's birthday. His comments are predictably critical, but they are more nuanced than many people might think and might be led to believe. And I wanted just to share this nuance as explained by Professor John Hoover, who I hope one day to have as a guest on Blogging Theology, God willing. So on page 66 of this book, Professor John Hoover tells us, Ibn Taymiyya also critiques innovated Muslim festivals in his book, The Necessity of the Straight Path. One example is the festival of the Prophet's birthday, or Mawlid as it's popularly known, which Muslims in Ibn Taymiyya's time celebrated on a wide scale. Still the case today, of course. Much of the Muslim world still celebrates it, as indeed they did recently. It was commonly regarded as a good innovation, although some scholars rejected it as unlawful and worthless. Ibn Taymiyya takes a subtler approach. This is where it gets interesting, I think. He does reject celebration of the Prophet's birthday as unlawful because it has no support in the Quran and the Sunnah, and explains that Christians established festivals to commemorate events in the life of Jesus, but Muslims do not turn events in the life of their Prophet into festival days. The only Islamic festivals that are those that God and the Prophet Muhammad have legislated. Nevertheless, Ibn Taymiyya recognizes different intentions among those who celebrate the Prophet's birthday. And this is where the nuance comes in. He condemns those who celebrate it simply to imitate Christians who celebrate Christmas, but he allows that some celebrate it out of great love for the Prophet. The latter may receive a great reward for their worthy intention and their exercise of independent legal reasoning in finding the ritual lawful, even if there is no reward in practicing the innovated festival itself. While the only proper way to show love for the Prophet is to follow his sunnah, Ibn Taymiyya is alert to the fact that people do not give up something without replacing it with something else. So he cautions against calling people away from the celebration of the Prophet's birthday unless they can be guided to replace it with something lawful and better, not something even worse. By lawful, I think, is meant here in accordance with the Sharia, Islamic law. Ibn Taymiyya's approach to the Prophet's birthday and non-Muslim rituals is similar to his attitude towards the Sufi ecstatic experience of annihilation, or fana, F-A-N-A. He allows that annihilation may bring someone closer to God, even if not in the best fashion, and in much the same way, he recognizes the possibility of good intention and benefit in celebration of the Prophet's birthday, even if it remains unlawful and detrimental overall. Non-Muslims may likewise derive some benefit from their rituals, but not enough to overcome their detriment. For Ibn Taymiyya, the law is the repository of full benefit, so the Sharia contains all that is necessary. It's complete. Yet his careful attention to intention and benefit enables him to take a nuanced view of the spiritual value of worship practices lying outside the scope of the law. Polemically minded modern-day Sufis and Salafis have taken this in different directions. Some Sufis have pounced on Ibn Taymiyyah's statement that those who celebrate the Prophet's birthday will receive a great reward, in order to claim that he approves of the festival. Salafis focus on Ibn Taymiyyah's criticism of the Prophet's birthday and generally ignore the great reward remark or dismiss its significance. It does not fit easily with their view of Ibn Taymiyyah as defender of the law against innovation, he says. And in the second part of this video, I just want to read from Professor John Hoover's comments on grave visitation and intercession in the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah. And I personally found this very instructive and enlightening. John Hoover, by the way, is not a Muslim, but he's recognized globally as an expert, one of the world's leading experts on the thought of Ibn Taymiyyah. So on page 68, entitled Grave Visitation and Intercession, Professor John Hoover writes, Ibn Taymiyyah is also greatly concerned about innovations surrounding the visitation of graves. He treats the relevant issues in the book The Necessity of the Straight Path and many other texts. Ibn Taymiyyah was well acquainted with shrine culture and probably even participated in it in early life. Now this I didn't realize. Ibn Taymiyyah writes, I and others used to follow the doctrine of the fathers in visiting graves. We used to uphold the views of the innovators. When it became clear to us what the prophet, the messenger, had brought, we had to decide whether to follow what God had revealed or to follow what we had found our fathers doing. It was obligatory to follow the messenger, end quote. Across his works, Ibn Taymiyyah speaks of oaths, vows, supplications, animal sacrifices, and the names of graves that pilgrims visited. He says that God honors and shows mercy to the saints and the righteous among the dead, and amazing wonders occur at their graves. Their graves are protected from animals, fire, and evil spirits, and it is advantageous to be buried near them. He also maintains that visiting graves is lawful and that it can be beneficial. Lawful grave visitation includes greeting the dead, supplicating for them, and visiting them in order to remind oneself of one's mortality. Despite all this, Ibn Taymiyyah is most profoundly worried that shrine religion will descend into idolatry and polytheism, in Arabic, shirk. The crux of the issue is supplication and intercession. Saints and their graves were regarded as repositories of blessing, and, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, people too readily turn to the dead in their time of need instead of God. He forbids supplicating a dead saint or prophet directly because it is outright polytheism. He also prohibits asking a saint or prophet to intercede before God. He does acknowledge that the companions sought the Prophet Muhammad's intercession while he was still alive. However, this does not give license for seeking intercession from the Prophet at his grave. The proper way to seek access to God through the Prophet is to believe in him and obey him. Ibn Taymiyyah explains that it is unbelief and polytheism to think that intermediaries are required to access God in the same way that intermediaries are required to access a king. Unlike a king, God knows the affairs of his creatures directly and needs no help in dealing with them. God also needs no prodding to treat his creatures well. Therefore, Ibn Taymiyyah argues, only God can be asked to forgive sins and guide hearts. The only intercession that is acceptable to God is that which God himself permits, such as his permission such as his permission to the Prophet Muhammad, other prophets, and other righteous persons to intercede before God in the hereafter, especially for believers whose sins earn them a temporary place in hellfire. Ibn Taymiyya also criticizes praying directly to God in the name of a saint or prophet, even if this is not as bad as praying directly to a living saint or asking a dead saint to intercede. Furthermore, he argues that performing the ritual prayer at graves and turning graves into mosques have been prohibited in order to avert the temptations of idolatry. These things would have been permitted had their benefit outweighed their harm. Instead, domes and mosques built over graves must be demolished. So far as we know, Ibn Taymiyya himself did not destroy any funerary monuments, but his sentiments have inspired such iconoclastic acts by Wahhabis and modern jihadis, as Professor John Hoover calls them. As noted above, Ibn Taymiyya does permit visiting graves to greet the dead, offer supplications for them, and benefit from the reminder of one's mortality. Nevertheless, he attempts to undercut shrine religion by denouncing travel for the sole purpose of visiting graves, even for the purpose of visiting the Prophet's grave in Medina. Ibn Taymiyya grounds his position in the Prophet's statement, "Do not undertake travel except to 3 mosques, namely the mosques of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem." Travelling to graves deliberately to perform supplications is disliked because it resembles the practices of pre-Islamic times. It distracts from legislated rituals like the pilgrimage to Mecca, and it diverts from worshipping God alone. Ibn Taymiyya also seeks to undermine the shrine cults by denying that a place can be inherently sacred. He deems the virtue of a place to be a function of the moral value of the people living in it, not of the place itself. Ibn Taymiyya says that God has designated some places to be especially efficacious, such as the mosques in Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, but that is by virtue of God's designation. Places are not holy in and of themselves. In this light, supplication at graves is no more efficacious than supplication anywhere else. Even asking God to help the dead, which Ibn Taymiyya permits, is no more effective at their graves than anywhere else. Many other aspects of shrine religion receive Ibn Taymiyya's censure. He criticizes making vows to dead saints and offering animal sacrifices at graves, not surprisingly. He condemns kissing the ground in front of a grave, touching and kissing graves, lighting candles over graves at night, leaving supplications on notes at graves, sprinkling graves with rose water and perfume, and making a living as a grave custodian. He also complains that grave cults had led to the spread of many lies. Graves had been identified incorrectly, and fanciful legends had grown up around the shrines. Ibn Taymiyya's arguments, and this is Professor John Hoover's conclusion here, and he offers some counter-arguments that some other scholars have made. Ibn Taymiyya's arguments did not dampen enthusiasm for shrine religion in the Mamluk Empire, and indeed shrine worship is still very popular today, I understand, in the Muslim world. As we saw at the end of chapter 2, opposition to his views on grave visitation led to his final demise, because he was imprisoned numerous times for his views. After Ibn Taymiyya died, the Shafi jurist Taqi al-Din al-Subki wrote a refutation that affirmed travel to Medina solely for the purpose of visiting the Prophet's grave. Al-Subki supports his case with a hadith reporting the Prophet's statement, quote, "My intercession is guaranteed for whoever visits my grave," unquote. Ibn Taymiyya considered this hadith report weak in its authenticity or simply forged. Al-Subki also charges Ibn Taymiyya with exaggerating the abuses surrounding grave visitation. It does not necessarily lead to polytheism, and it is not, in fact, an innovation because there are precedents from the time of the Prophet. End quote. So there's much food for thought there. These are incredibly controversial issues, still very much debated and argued over, often with much heat and passion, in my experience, amongst Muslims today. And it's not my place as a non-scholar layman to offer my opinion, but I do want to share the expertise in terms of Western scholars' research into the life, times and thought of Ibn Taymiyya, to offer what is perhaps a more nuanced understanding of Ibn Taymiyya's position than is perhaps more popularly expressed, where it's simply binary black and white. Yes, Ibn Taymiyya condemned many of these practices, but he also recognized, it seems, that sometimes people's intentions can be noble and good, and they will be rewarded for their intentions, even if the act itself fell outside of the halal, the permitted in Islamic law. So I'll leave that book for the moment. I do want to come back. There's actually much more in this book I want to share on videos, in future videos, particularly controversial statements of Ibn Taymiyya. God is sitting over his throne. What do we understand? What did he understand by that? Kalam theology, of course, very controversial for modern followers of Ibn Taymiyya's thought. And Sufism as in general. There's more on Sufist practices as well. But until next time.